In my last video, you may have seen me cut 45-degree bevels up against my fence like this without using a sled. Cross-cutting against the fence is usually a no-no for safety reasons, and while these panels were wide enough for me to feel safe doing this, I figured it was time to build a decent 45-degree cross-cut sled. People typically recommend using 3/4 inch plywood as a base because it's flat and sturdy. I only have this 1/2 inch ply on hand, but I can see that it has a tendency to cup, so I'd rather not use this. But I also want to avoid running to the store given the current situation, so I thought maybe I could use this piece of laminated particle board. It's dead flat and has the advantage of being lighter than plywood. My only hesitation is that the surface is super slick, and I wonder if this might cause the panel to move while I'm cutting. There's no adherence, unlike plywood, which kinda sticks to wood. On the other hand, the laminate's slick surface will definitely be an advantage when it comes to moving this heavy sled, and there's very little resistance against the table. Well, I guess we'll just have to build it and see. The first step will be to cut the base to size. I randomly decided to make the sled 36 inches wide, which should be long enough to support the types of panel I expect to cut. I also want to avoid making it too big to keep the weight down. I used my track saw to make the cut, then took it over to the table saw to cut it to width. I decided to make it no bigger than the depth of my saw, which is 27 inches. But first, before going any further, I'm going to change my blade and install a melamine cutting blade to get clean cuts on this panel. In fact, I decided this will be the blade I always use with this sled since it's ideal for cutting laminate panels or melamine and veneered plywood. So with the melamine blade installed, I set my fence to 27 inches and made the cut. You know, seeing how smoothly this slides, I'm beginning to think I'm onto something with this laminated particle board. Next, it's time to make the runners, which are key to the success of this sled. You may have seen me use plastic runners before, and I just love them. Not only do they slide super smooth, but they're always a perfect fit right out of the package. But since I said this would be a basic sled, today I'm going to make my own runners out of this leftover piece of maple floorboard. After cutting off the tongue, I set my fence to 3/4 inch and ripped a strip. I can see that it's a little too big, so I'll adjust my fence ever so slightly and trim off a little more. You want the runners to slide nicely without any side-to-side play, so this looks perfect. Without adjusting the fence, I cut the second runner and tested it as well. Just as expected, it was a perfect fit. Woo! Okay, sorry. Now I can set my fence to 3/8, flip the runners on their side, and rip down the thickness. At 3/8, they should sit just below the surface of the table, which is perfect. Next, I'm going to attach the runners to the sled. Since my blade tilts left, I decided to skew the sled to the right of the blade so that I'll have more support for long panels. I set my fence at 26 inches, and that way the blade should be just around here. Because the runners sit below the surface, I'm using a few pennies to raise them up so they'll make contact with the panel. Canadian pennies were phased out in 2012, but I keep a few on hand just for this. Here I'm applying a very thin bead of melamine glue, not too much so it won't get all over my table saw. Then using the fence as a reference, I can just drop in the panel and simply make sure the runners are aligned with the edges. I added some weights on top of the runners and let it sit for about an hour. Looks like it worked, so I can now permanently attach the runners with screws. I carefully made some pilot holes using a countersink bit and secured the runners with some number 6 3/4 inch screws, making sure the heads were sunken. Okay, let's give it a try. Wow. Maybe I got lucky. Maybe it's the laminate, but boy does this slide smoothly, and I haven't even added any paste wax yet. Next, I'm going to add a back fence. And just a note that at its highest, my blade only reaches about 2 1/8, so the fence doesn't have to be too high, nor does it have to be full length, just enough to cover the runners basically. Just to make it smoother to the touch, I'm going to round the corners using my bench sander. Then I'll use a roundover bit to break the sharp edges. Okay, so now I can just clamp the back fence on. It doesn't have to be square, it's really just here to hold the sled together. I made pilot holes using a countersink bit and attached the fence using number 8 1 1/4 inch screws, making sure to avoid the area between the runners where the blade will pass. Next, I set my blade to 45 degrees, making sure to be super accurate. Then ran the sled through to cut the kerf. but stopped just short from the front edge, leaving a few inches intact. The front fence needs to be dead flat, so I first thought about using some more laminate, but the particle board core is brittle and won't hold screws very well, so I was afraid it wouldn't hold up. So instead, I'm going to glue a few pieces of 1/2-inch plywood together, which should help keep them flat. I'm using 3 pieces of 1/2 inch, but 2 pieces of 3/4 inch should work just the same. I added ample glue and spread it around. If you're wondering why I'm doing this glue up on the table saw, it's so I can use the fence as a backer and clamp these fences together. Pun intended. In order to make sure the fence stays dead flat. Now here's where I realized my first mistake. I had cut my plywood in the wrong direction and I had made a 24-inch fence instead of a 36-inch fence. So I ripped down some more plywood and started all over again. While the glue was still wet, I took the time to scrape off the excess before it dried, so I didn't have to scrape it off later. And then I realized my second mistake. Wax paper does not protect cast iron from glue. So with my table rusted up, I took this opportunity to thoroughly clean my table saw, and if you're interested, I just posted my cleaning process over on Instagram if you want to check that out there. With the glue now dried, I ran the fence through the table saw to clean off the glue and flipped it over to trim it down to size at about 2.5 inches tall. I did the same for the ends and cut it to 36 inches long. Just as I had done for the back fence, I rounded over the top corners and rounded over the edges, then sanded it smooth to the touch. While I'm at it, I used a chamfer bit to make a tiny chamfer on the bottom edge of the fence, just so the sawdust will have somewhere to go without getting in the way. Now the front fence needs to be perfectly perpendicular to the blade, and to do this I'll first add a screw on the left end, then adjust the right side. Using a framing square, I adjusted the fence until it was perfectly square with the curved line. I really took my time here, checking on both sides of the blade. When I was satisfied, I delicately added a clamp, then checked it again to make sure nothing had moved. I added a single screw from underneath, then one more towards the middle using a straight edge to make sure the fence wasn't bowed. Before adding any more screws, I'm going to test it out for accuracy. Now there are some very precise ways to do this, like the 5-cut method, but I'm just going to cut a large panel in half, then flip over one piece and see if the seams line up, without any gaps. So here it is again. After making the cut, I flip one piece over, and making sure to butt both pieces up against the back fence, I gently push them inwards. I can see the seam lines up perfectly, so that's good enough for me. If the seams don't line up, adjust the fence and secure it using a new screw hole and test it again. If you're lucky like I was, simply add some more screws and you're done. Now for example, if I wanted to cut a 13-inch panel, I just make a mark and then line that up with the inside of the kerf just like this, and then make the cut. Okay, let's test it out. Yep, exactly 13 inches. In the end, the laminated particle board turned out to be a great choice for making a sled. It slides super smoothly on the table without friction, it's sturdy and dead flat. And my concerns about the panel sliding around when I made the cut were completely unfounded. I definitely recommend trying out laminate for your next sled. In my next video, I'll be making floating shelves using the sled, so be sure to check back for that video or subscribe to my channel to get notified when I post new videos. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.